For decades, the exclusion zone around Chernobyl has been a source of anxiety, myth, and clandestine research. In the Stalker universe, that anxiety has crystallized into a second disaster, one that birthed the anomalies, mutants, and artifacts we know today. But imagine a freak emission far more powerful than anything ever recorded. In one cataclysmic event, the boundaries that contained the zone collapse under the sheer force of its expanding influence. Only 7.5% of the people watching has subscribed, so if you haven't already, please consider doing so. Such an emission wouldn't merely release radioactive fallout, it would unleash the warped reality that defines the zone. Like a stone dropped into a still pond, this massive wave of anomaly energy would ripple outward, crossing into Belarus, Russia, Poland, and Romania in mere days. Towns and villages that had always considered themselves safe would wake to find roiling storms overhead, invisible pockets of distorted gravity in their fields, and mutated wildlife prowling their once peaceful streets. In this apocalyptic scenario, the zone ceases to be an isolated Ukrainian phenomenon. Instead, it morphs into a rapidly spreading frontier, changing the fundamental nature of the region. Imagine local farmers discovering entire patches of farmland turned into crackling anomaly fields, or an emission wave transforming a scenic countryside into a twisted reflection of what existed just hours before. Governments would scramble to respond, but the unstoppable nature of these anomalies far exceeds any conventional means of containment. The first sign of this expanded zone emerges as seemingly random calamities in Eastern Europe. Planes plummet from clear skies over Poland, electronics short out en masse in Belarus, and unnatural storms ravage the forests along the Russian border. Initially, each disaster is blamed on local system failures or bizarre weather events. But as the reports mount, governments and media outlets begin connecting the dots. Something is warping reality on a massive scale. Panic would grip the continent. Countries bordering Ukraine invoke emergency protocols. Bridges and highways become choke points, swarmed by military convoys and refugees alike. The European Union imposes immediate travel bans and sets up ad hoc refugee camps for those fleeing the new anomalies. Meanwhile, NATO readies aerial reconnaissance and dispatches special units to gather intelligence. But how do you quarantine an inexorable expansion of space-bending phenomena? Beyond Europe, global powers like the United States, China, and Japan realize that this could become an international crisis. Satellite imagery picks up an ominous glow spreading outwards from the Chernobyl region, its growth marked by spikes of electromagnetic distortion that blot out communications. In an emergency session at the United Nations, conflicting interests emerge. Some nations push for aggressive containment, airstrikes if necessary, while others advocate caution, fearing that brute force methods might trigger even worse emissions or create pockets of irreparable chaos worldwide. With the zone metastasizing across borders, the established Stalker factions face monumental challenges. Duty, now spread impossibly thin, coordinates with foreign armies to hold crucial strategic points. Freedom sees an opportunity for their ideology to spread like wildfire, but they are quickly confronted with the grim reality that more territory also means more danger and more competition. At the same time, brand new factions would arise from the crisis. Perhaps in Poland, an Iron Gate emerges, a coalition of ex-military officers, local militia, and academic volunteers who establish fortified checkpoints at critical crossroads. Their goal would be to protect the masses from new anomalies and keep smugglers at bay. In Belarus, rogue scientists and renegade ecologists who disagree with official policies form the Red Canary Group, dedicated to harnessing anomalies for defensive technology and medical breakthroughs. Mercenary cliques multiply, many financed by wealthy corporations salivating at the prospect of reaping new artifacts from a vastly expanded zone. A black market arms race ensues. Bribes become the currency of survival at hastily erected border forts. Entire convoys vanish into the swirling mist. Outposts set up by duty or local militaries frequently come under siege from opportunistic bandits who realize this expansion is their golden ticket to control entire smuggling routes. In effect, Eastern Europe becomes one giant puzzle of alliances, betrayals, and hidden motives, an echo of the original zone, but on a scale no one could have imagined. A crucial difference between this new scenario and the original zone is the collision of anomalies with dense urban centers. In Ukraine, much of the zone is rural, dotted with small settlements and industrial ruins. Now, entire European capitals are threatened by swirling energy fields and gravity distortions. The result would be quarantined city districts, hastily walled off by the military to prevent anomalies from spreading further inward. Imagine stepping into once thriving neighborhoods that now bear the hallmark of the zone's corruption: blazing electro-anomalies surging through underground tunnels, poltergeist entities lurking in gutted shopping malls, and gravitational distortions that can lift entire vehicles into the air. With millions of civilians refusing or unable to evacuate, some due to loyalty to their homes, others due to government restrictions, chaos becomes the new normal. Emergency services are completely overwhelmed. Firefighters can't extinguish phantom flames that erupt from anomalies. Police can't handle mutated wildlife that moves through the sewers. New volunteer brigades step in. Some are local heroes, others are ex-stalkers from the original zone, charging exorbitant fees to guide rescue teams. For the first time, the horrors once contained near Chernobyl are playing out in Europe's iconic squares and streets, creating a dystopian patchwork of daily life. With the zone's expansion comes the discovery of new exotic artifacts, far beyond the standard ones like Soul, Crystal Thorn, or Moonlight. Scientists hastily classify these anomalies, naming them after local mythological concepts. Artifacts that conjure illusions, dampen electromagnetic fields over city blocks, or even warp temperature on a massive scale. A scientific renaissance and moral crisis begins to unfold. Universities and corporate labs clamor for research samples, hoping to harness artifact energies for breakthroughs in green energy, medicine, or even defense. Nations covertly fund Black Ops teams to capture such items before rivals do. The illicit artifact market sees skyrocketing prices. A single rare artifact might fetch millions of euros on the black market in Berlin, Paris, or Geneva. Smugglers become local folk legends, turning entire city blocks into labyrinths of deals and double crosses. But this arms race comes at a steep price. Each new artifact extracted from an anomaly risks destabilizing that area further, potentially sparking micro-emissions. Entire research stations vanish when an artifact is tampered with incorrectly, leaving behind crater-like anomalies that swallow buildings whole. The question becomes, how far will humanity push, chasing profit or scientific acclaim, before the zone's destructive nature devours them all? Politically, the expansion of the zone triggers a full-blown international crisis. EU members are torn between using their collective resources to contain the spread and shutting their borders to keep out waves of refugees. Russia, with its massive borderland, positions entire military blockades to block anomalies from penetrating deeper into the territory. This increases tensions with NATO. Meanwhile, smaller nations near Ukraine struggle to maintain internal stability. Their officials must choose between aligning with powerful foreign blocs offering assistance or forging precarious alliances with local factions like Freedom or Duty. Diplomatic standoffs become as intense as the firefights at the edges of anomalies. Accusations fly. Some governments suspect corporate interference is fueling the expansion for profit, or that certain labs might be deliberately experimenting on the edges of newly formed anomalies to glean strategic advantages. Conspiracy theories flourish, claiming that the original S.T.A.L.K.E.R labs in Ukraine orchestrated this cataclysm to force the world's hand. The United Nations attempts to mediate, but their peacekeeping forces, unprepared for anomalies and mutants, are pushed to the brink, transforming them into reluctant participants in the scramble to adapt. Adding to the complexity is the constant threat of rogue blowouts. Massive, spontaneous bursts of zone energy that can affect areas far beyond the main epicenters. Entire negotiations or summits might be cut short by sudden emissions, leaving top diplomats stranded in a haze of swirling lights, forced to rely on old-school stalker tactics like bolt throwing or to safely navigate back to base. These moments lay bare the vulnerability of even the most powerful leaders when faced with the phenomena that answers to no human command. Beneath the chaos of governments and militias lies an ocean of personal tragedy. Families in rural areas, once distant from any threat, now find themselves living inside an anomaly-riddled wasteland overnight. Communication lines fail, roads become impassable due to gravitational traps, and livestock mutate or die off. Schools shut down, hospitals overflow, and radiation burn victims, and young children grow up never knowing a world beyond the zone's twilight. For these forgotten souls, daily life becomes an endless battle for food, water, and medicine. In some areas, newly formed enclaves try to salvage a semblance of normalcy, creating farmland around anomalies, navigating pockets of safe terrain, and establishing trade with wandering stalkers. But in many places, local warlords would emerge. They use fear and control over precious resources, like uncontaminated water or safe pathways, to rule with iron fists. People are exploited as labor, forced to scavenge for artifacts or guard territory without pay, all in the name of protection from the greater horrors of the zone. The moral dilemmas here are stark. Ordinary citizens might find themselves forced into uneasy alliances with armed factions that promise security, or they might risk going alone in the wilderness, often turning to petty crime just to survive. The cruelty and heartbreak highlight the core truth of Stalker. Human nature can be as savage as any mutant when desperation rules the day. Traditionally, the word stalker conjures an image of lone wolves or ragtag groups braving the Ukrainian zone for profits or answers. But as the boundaries widen, that identity would transform. Where once being a stalker was a niche calling, now it's a cross-border occupation. Former Spec Ops personnel or out-of-work security contractors and even adrenaline-seeking civilians flock to the new anomaly-ridden zones, hungry for artifacts and prestige. One might encounter entire multinational squads, a Ukrainian veteran teaching anomaly detection techniques to a French ex-legionnaire and a Polish paramedic. They swap stories around campfires about near-death experiences and swirling vortexes. They trade tips on how to appease local gangs and avoid the wrath of well-armed mercenary corporations. Over time, these squads develop a culture that merges various military traditions and languages with the dusty, worn aesthetic of the original zone survival gear. Yet, this wave of newcomers often clashes with the old guard, those who once roamed the zone before it expanded. Veterans who remember the simpler days around the cordon or a garbage see these new arrivals as interlopers, more concerned with quick profits than respecting the zone's power. Disputes would escalate into violence, especially when rookies trigger anomalies that kill entire squads or disrupt carefully negotiated peace between local factions. And always, behind every argument, looms the menacing presence of mutated beasts and potential emissions. When the zone expands, it drags with it the nightmarish menagerie of mutated life forms. Bloodsuckers once confined to the Pripyat underbelly now roam the subways of Warsaw, feeding on unsuspected scavengers. Snorks, twisted reflections of human soldiers, prowl abandoned highways near the Belarus border, ambushing travelers who thought themselves safe in broad daylight. Yet beyond these familiar terrors, new variants would emerge. In the Carpathian highlands, mountain wolves exposed to anomaly fields might develop partial camouflage or telepathic senses, forming predatory packs that silently coordinate attacks. Down by the Danube, giant catfish rumored to have mutated in the original zone spread through connected river systems, growing to monstrous sizes and dragging small boats underwater. Some rumors even speak of entire flocks of mutated birds migrating over Central Europe, leaving behind trails of psychic residue that drive livestock insane. For the first time, major ecosystems outside of Ukraine feel the direct influence of the zone. Environmental agencies scramble to manage invasive species that are now more than just pests. They are lethal, reality-bending anomalies within themselves. Concerns grow that the spread could trigger a global biodiversity crisis, overshadowing any known ecological disaster. Nations scramble for solutions. Some propose mass culls via drone strikes, while others suggest quarantining entire swaths of land and writing them off as permanently lost. Welcome to the new era of the zone. No longer a single quarantine region in Ukraine, but a patchwork of mutated landscapes stretching across borders. Safe zones become the new city-states of Eastern Europe, each with its own rules and alliances. In some, ex-military groups implement strict curfews and weapon checks. In others, a laissez-faire approach prevails, letting artifact trade flourish unfettered. However, the inexorable threat of emissions unites all these enclaves in a shared dread. When the sirens wail, everyone dives for cover, whether in a repurposed Cold War bunker or a hastily reinforced basement. Scientists race against time to create large-scale solutions, perhaps an advanced version of the psi-blocker that once shielded stalkers from the brain scorcher. Some dream of building emission-dampening towers along newly expanded borders. Others propose harnessing certain artifacts to stabilize anomalies, effectively freezing them in place. But each experiment flirts with disaster, risking local blowouts or spawning new mutant strains. The unpredictability of the zone becomes an almost sentient force, refusing to be tamed. And so, we enter an era where the zone is no longer just a place. It is a phenomena creeping into everyday life. people in safer territories watched the news with dread, seeing stories of entire Hungarian villages swallowed by glowing fog overnight, or highways in Slovakia turned into war zones between monstrous creatures and desperate mercenaries. The boundary between the normal and the uncanny grows razor thin, reminding everyone that no place is truly safe anymore. In this augmented reality of an expanded zone, the story possibilities skyrocket. You could find yourself in the role of a stalker recruited by a multinational task force to locate a rumored artifact that can temporarily steal anomalies, an object that could tip the balance between chaos and stability. Or maybe your mission is to evacuate an entire town swallowed by an unexpected blowout, leading you through labyrinth cityscapes, time-warped tunnels, and mutant-infested suburbs. Missions might send you to the heart of a newly formed metropolis anomaly, a swirling vortex enveloping half of Berlin, where ghostly echoes of daily life loop over and over. You would navigate intangible illusions of city dwellers who existed moments before the anomaly hit, searching for clues to stop the expansion. Alternatively, you might encounter a questline involving corporate-funded mercenaries trying to harness a super artifact in the Swiss Alps. Now, it's not just about survival, it's about shaping the fate of entire nations. Imagine the moral quandaries. Do you hand a life-saving artifact to a repressive regime that promises order, or do you entrust it to an anarchic coalition that might squander its power? Do you prioritize rescuing civilians in newly devastated regions, or strike deals with cunning warlords offering safe passage and supplies? S.T.A.L.K.E.R has always thrived on moral complexity, and an expanded zone would amplify those dilemmas globally. This is but one scenario about what could happen if the zone expanded beyond Ukraine. It's a stark reminder that forces we barely comprehend can upend the most carefully drawn borders. In S.T.A.L.K.E.R, the zone serves as a metaphor for the unpredictability of science gone awry, and the stubborn resilience of life under existential threat. But those nightmares sprawl across nations. The question is no longer how do we fix it, but rather can we even endure? On one hand, humanity's unquenchable thirst for profit and power would escalate, with corporations, mercenaries, and warlords all diving headlong into this new frontier. On the other, acts of altruism and ingenuity might spring from the unlikeliest of places, as people band together to protect their homes and harness anomalies for the greater good. The expanded zone becomes a crucible, testing not just the will of individual stalkers, but the capacity of entire societies to adapt and cooperate. In a way, the second era of the zone reveals humanity's deepest strengths and weaknesses on a scale never before seen. Fear, greed, and desperation clash with hope, resourcefulness, and compassion. Could the world unite to keep the anomalies contained? Or would political scheming, corporate greed, and conflicting ideologies tear us further apart, turning the entire continent into a mosaic of warring enclaves? Ultimately, S.T.A.L.K.E.R has always shown us that the greatest monsters aren't necessarily the mutants, but rather the human capacity for cruelty when left unchecked. Yet, it also reminds us that even in the darkest corners of the zone, light can shine through. If the zone did expand, we would see both extremes on a global stage, the ugliest face of humanity, and moments of selfless courage that defy reason. Because survival in the zone, whether in the Ukrainian heartland or across the entire map of Europe, hinges on a fragile balance of wits, luck, and moral choice. So where would you run, once there's nowhere left untouched by the zone? Thank you all again for tuning into this video. As always, if you enjoyed it, please don't hesitate to drop a comment, like, and subscribe down below. There is also a Discord channel that you can join, and the link is provided in the description. Thank you all again, and take care.